Celia Kane was the last one left in the office again, her fingers tapping furiously at the keyboard as the clock above her flicked past 9. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound left in the 27th floor of Arden Enterprises. Everyone else had cleared out hours ago, meetings adjourned, coffee mugs washed, lights turned off. But Celia had deadlines, and she had something to prove. She didn't notice the tall figure stepping off the private elevator at the far end of the hallway. Nor did she hear the distinct click of Italian leather shoes against the polished marble floor. Xavier Ashford leaned against the glass wall of the conference room just outside her cubicle, arms crossed, silent. He watched her, not just with curiosity, but the kind of focus that made it hard to breathe. She didn't know he was there, she never did, he should have left. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there like he had for the past 3 weeks, staying late under the guise of reviewing contracts or clearing emails, when in reality, he was mesmerized by her. The way she bit her lip when she was frustrated, how she tucked her hair behind her ear without realizing. The way she never once looked at the clock, even when everyone else was racing to beat traffic, she was too focused, too unaware. And that drove him crazy. Celia finally sighed, pushing her chair back and stretching her arms above her head. Her back cracked and she winced. "God, what time is it?" she muttered to herself, not expecting an answer. "Past 9, Xavier said from the shadows. Her entire body jerked as she turned sharply. "Oh my God, Mr. Ashford!" The lights in the hallway flickered on with the motion sensor, casting him in a golden glow. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent for the year. His tie was loosened, the top button of his white shirt undone, and he looked, not like a CEO, but like something out of a dream she had no business entertaining. "You scared me," she added quickly, fixing her blouse and straightening. "I didn't mean to, you were, very focused." Celia's face flushed. "Sorry, I didn't realize anyone else was still here." "You say that every time," she blinked. I've seen you here late." "Many times." He stepped closer until he was standing just outside her cubicle. "Do you always stay this late?" She laughed awkwardly. "Only when the design team decides to change the graphics at the last second, and the client presentations tomorrow." Xavier's eyes flicked to the screen. "You're doing all that alone, pretty much," she hesitated. "I don't really mind, I do." His voice was low, serious. "You shouldn't have to." Celia didn't know what to say to that. She swallowed, reaching for her mouse. "It's part of the job." "No, it's not," he said. "Not when the rest of your team clocked out before 6. She stared at him, confused. "Why are you still here?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe I had a reason." Her stomach fluttered, but she quickly shook it off. He was the CEO, a billionaire. He could have had dinner with the mayor or flown to Paris for dessert if he wanted to. There was no way he was here for her. "I'll be done in 20 minutes, she said, trying to deflect. Xavier didn't leave. Instead, he walked behind her and looked at the screen. "You're using the wrong version of the logo." "What?" She turned back. "No, this is the updated." He clicked the file beside it. "That's the new one. We rebranded last week. I didn't announce it yet." She stared at him. "Then how was I supposed to know you weren't?" he said simply. "But now you do." He looked at her again. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes tired but still bright. "Come on," he said suddenly. "What? Let me take you to dinner." Celia blinked. "Dinner? It's almost 10. Exactly, you've worked all night. Let me thank you." She stood slowly. "Mr. Ashford, I don't think that's Xavier," he interrupted. "What? My name, call me Xavier." She hesitated. "Xavier, I really don't think it's not a date," he said smoothly. "It's gratitude." She narrowed her eyes. "Gratitude with you in a suit and me looking like I've been hit by a spreadsheet tornado," he laughed, and it was low and warm. "You look fine, come on. There's a place still open downtown." "You're serious?" "Celia," he said, stepping closer. "I'm always serious." She stared at him for a beat, trying to figure out what the hell was happening, then she grabbed her coat. The restaurant was upscale, tucked behind a velvet curtain on a quiet street. The kind of place that didn't have a menu, just chefs who came to your table and asked what you were in the mood for. Celia felt wildly out of place in her worn flats and creased blouse, but Xavier didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He ordered for both of them something with black truffle and handmade pasta paired with wine that didn't even have a label. The waiter didn't ask for a card, just nodded and left. Celia glanced around. "You come here often." "Sometimes," Xavier said. "When I want to be invisible." "Invisible?" she laughed. "You're Xavier Ashford, billionaire CEO. You're literally on the cover of Forbes." He looked at her. "Exactly, which is why I like places where no one looks at me like that." "Like what?" He didn't answer. They ate, and the conversation drifted from work to music to travel. He told her about his time in Italy, how he once almost bought a vineyard on a whim. She told him about her college days, waitressing and designing flyers for local bands just to pay rent. "You're talented," he said, sipping his wine. "I've seen your work. You're the only reason that tech client renewed last quarter." Celia's brows lifted. "Wait, you knew that was me? I know everything that happens in my company, especially when it comes to you." She paused, heart thudding. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because I can't stop noticing you, and I don't think I want to." Silence settled between them. Celia's breath caught. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Xavier said, "and I want to know more." She looked away, overwhelmed. He leaned forward. "Tell me I'm not the only one who feels this." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. When he walked her to her car, the night air was cool, quiet. He opened the door for her, but before she stepped in, she turned to face him. "Why me?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Because you're the only person who doesn't treat me like I'm untouchable. You're real, smart, honest. You actually care about what you do, and for the first time in a long time, I care about something that doesn't involve numbers or bottom lines." Celia's voice was soft. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me see you again." She hesitated, then nodded. He smiled, really smiled, and closed her door gently as she drove off, her heart racing. She didn't realize she'd just started falling for the one man she never expected, and she had no idea. He already had. The next morning, Celia stepped off the elevator gripping a paper tray of coffee like it was a shield. Her heels clicked across the tile as she made her way toward her desk, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Her mind was still tangled in the surreal blur of the night before luxury hidden behind velvet, wine that tasted like silk, and Xavier Ashford looking at her like she was the only person in the room. She hadn't slept. Not really. A few hours of tossing under worn sheets while replaying every word he'd said. Every glance. Every charged silence. It had to mean something. And yet what was she supposed to do with that? This wasn't some romantic comedy. She worked in his building, under his name. She couldn't afford to misinterpret anything. "Celia." She froze. The voice was too close. Turning, she saw Clara from accounting leaning against the filing cabinet, stirring her coffee with a wooden stick. "I heard you had dinner with Ashford last night." Clara arched an eyebrow. Celia blinked. "What? Don't play dumb. Mark saw you two getting into his car at like 10. Celia's stomach twisted. "It wasn't what it looked like." Clara shrugged. "Didn't look like business. I didn't even know he was still in the building." She tried to keep her voice low. "He offered food. I said yes." "That's it." Clara tilted her head. "You sure that's all it was?" Celia didn't answer. She turned and walked away, heart pounding harder with every step, the buzz of whispered curiosity already starting to swarm. She barely sat down when her screen blinked with a calendar alert. A meeting. 30 minutes. Conference room 12. She clicked it open. No subject. No attendees listed. Just a time and a room. Her stomach dropped. When the clock hit 11, she stood and walked the corridor with practiced calm, even though her hands were damp and her pulse was racing. She pushed open the door to conference room 12. Xavier was already inside. He wasn't seated. He stood by the windows, jacket off, sleeves rolled halfway up. The view behind him stretched across the skyline, sun catching the metallic edge of buildings, but it was his expression that stopped her. He looked like he'd been waiting. "You came," he said quietly. "You scheduled a meeting," she replied, closing the door behind her. "I didn't want to ask in front of anyone." Celia crossed her arms. "People are already talking." He studied her face. "Do you care? I don't have the luxury not to. I didn't mean to put you in a position. You didn't, she said quickly, then hesitated, but we need to be careful. He walked toward her slowly. You think I haven't been careful? This isn't the same, she said. Last night crossed a line. I'm not sorry, Celia's breath caught. You should be. I'm not, he said again. And I don't think you are either. She looked away, unsure how to respond. I've been in this building for 6 years, he continued, and I've never asked anyone to dinner, not once. I've never stayed late watching someone work just to hear the sound of their voice. She turned back to him. That's not fair. It's the truth, Celia swallowed. You're my boss, for now. Her eyes widened. What does that mean? Xavier ran a hand through his hair. It means if this becomes something more, I'll step back. I'll find a way to shift the power dynamic. I won't risk your reputation for my feelings. She stared at him, stunned. He took a step closer. But I need to know if this is one-sided. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled tightly at her sides. I don't know what this is. Neither do I, he said, but I know it's real. She looked up at him. What happens if someone finds out? He held her gaze. Then I'll handle it. There was a knock at the door before she could respond. A junior associate peeked in, muttering something about a vendor call and apologizing before vanishing again. Xavier exhaled. We shouldn't talk here, Celia nodded. I should go. He didn't stop her. But as she walked out, she felt the weight of his eyes on her back all the way down the corridor. That afternoon, she tried to lose herself in work, but her focus slipped constantly. She kept rereading the same lines of copy, misplacing files, forgetting where she'd saved updated drafts. Her supervisor asked if she was coming down with something. Celia forced a smile and blamed the weather. When the office began to thin out after 6, she stayed behind again, pretending to adjust layouts while waiting for the building to clear. She didn't want to run into Xavier again. Not until she could sort out what she was feeling or what she was willing to risk. But just before 8, a brown envelope appeared on her desk. No name. No return address. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, the edges thick and embossed. The handwriting was smooth, exacting. If you want to know what comes next, meet me at the rooftop by 8:30. No pressure, no expectations, just clarity. No signature. Celia stared at it, her heart hammering. She shouldn't go, she knew that. She should crumple the note, toss it into the bin, and walk straight out of the building without looking back. But at 8:25, she was already in the elevator, her coat clutched in one hand, the envelope in the other. The rooftop was quiet, the city buzzing faintly below. String lights wrapped the railing, flickering gently in the wind. A small table stood at the center, set for 2. A bottle of something dark waited in a silver bucket, and 2 glasses caught the light. Xavier stood at the edge, his back to her. She stepped forward and he turned. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. I wasn't either, he gestured toward the table. Sit, she hesitated, then did. The wine was already uncorked. He poured without speaking. Celia sipped. It was cold and smooth, tasting faintly of cherries and something richer. Xavier leaned his arms on the table. I didn't bring you up here to push. Then why? I wanted to give you space, away from the office, away from anyone watching. She nodded slowly. It's beautiful up here. It's the only part of the building that feels real sometimes. She looked at him closely. There was something different in his face, less guarded, more raw. I used to come up here when my father ran the company, he said quietly, after meetings, after fights. After I realized I didn't want to do this the way he did. Celia listened, surprised. I was 27 when he handed me the reins. Everyone expected me to run it like a machine. Profits first, people second. She didn't interrupt. I made mistakes. I shut down. I stopped trusting my instincts. And now, he met her eyes. Now I'm learning to listen again, to myself, to the things that matter. She leaned back slightly. And you think I'm one of those? I know you are. She looked down at her glass, unsure what to say. I get that this is messy, he said. Complicated, but I don't want to pretend anymore. I want to know if there's a version of this that works. Celia drew a deep breath. If we do this, it changes everything. It already has, he said. The question is whether we're brave enough to see where it goes. She stared at him, her heart pounding. Then, slowly, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "I'm not saying yes," she whispered. "But I'm not saying no either." Xavier turned his palm upward, lacing their fingers together, and for the first time neither of them looked away. The next few days unfolded in a strange, careful rhythm. Celia kept her head down during work hours, eyes glued to her screen, posture rigid. She didn't linger in the break rooms or pause at the stairwell to chat with her usual circle. Her focus was sharper than ever, but not for the reasons anyone thought. She was trying not to think about Xavier. It didn't help that he was suddenly everywhere, not in obvious ways. He never once approached her at her desk or called her in for a meeting. But she'd feel his presence in the room before she even turned around. A glance from the far side of a strategy session. The faint echo of his voice in the hallway as he passed, never stopping, never speaking. But the tension tethered them anyway, invisible and electric. She hadn't answered the unspoken question he left hanging on the rooftop. Not fully. And she knew he was giving her space to decide, which only made it harder. The choice didn't feel hypothetical anymore. It felt inevitable. That Friday, the entire marketing department was summoned to the 11th floor for a last-minute presentation. Celia slipped into the back of the sleek conference room, taking a seat beside a window, hoping to blend into the crowd. Then the door opened, and Xavier stepped inside. He didn't look at her. His attention swept the room, expression unreadable. "Thank you for making time," he began. "This quarter's numbers exceeded expectations, but we're not coasting. We're redirecting." He clicked a remote. The screen behind him lit up with mock-ups of a new campaign, bolder than anything they'd done before. Celia leaned forward instinctively. The aesthetics were sharp, the messaging emotionally charged, but what caught her wasn't the visuals, it was the tagline. "Make it matter." 2 weeks ago, she'd scribbled those words at the bottom of a draft proposal, a throwaway line she wasn't sure anyone read, and now it was everywhere. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. She didn't need to. Xavier never looked her way, not once, but he didn't have to. The meeting ended with murmurs of approval and a few scattered questions. As the room cleared, Celia stayed behind, pretending to study the screen. "You're the only one who didn't clap," Xavier said from behind her. "I don't believe in applauding someone for using my words." He moved beside her, facing the screen. "I should have asked." "You didn't need to. I know what it meant." He turned toward her. "Do you?" Celia's pulse picked up. "You could have picked a dozen other lines." "I didn't want a dozen others." She folded her arms. "You're making it harder to keep things professional." "I'm not trying to make it easy." Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. "I booked the penthouse suite at the Larchmont for tomorrow," he said. "There's a private event for the new investors. I want you there." Celia blinked. "You want to bring me to a black tie gala?" "I want to bring you into my world, not in the shadows." She shook her head. "What are people going to think?" "They'll think whatever they want." "But I'm not hiding this." Her heart thudded. "Xavier, this isn't a game." "I know that, which is why I'm not inviting you as an accessory. I'm inviting you as someone who's already changed everything." She stared at him, torn between logic and something far more dangerous. "You'd be walking into a room full of executives, socialites, and board members, the kind of people who measure worth by the width of your last name and the weight of your watch. I know exactly who they are. And you still want me there." He stepped closer. "Especially because of that." She hesitated. "What am I supposed to wear to something like that?" "I already took care of it," he said. "A stylist will meet you at your apartment at noon." Her jaw dropped. "You sent someone to my apartment?" "I called your landlord, told him it was a delivery." "And before you panic, he didn't ask questions." "You're impossible," he smiled, softer now. "Only when I see something I want." The next day, Celia stood in front of a full-length mirror, staring at a reflection that didn't feel like her. The dress was floor-length, deep navy, and sculpted to her frame like it had been built from a breath and a promise. The stylist, an elegant woman named Myril, had swept her hair into a soft twist and added just a touch of color to her lips. The shoes were satin and unfamiliar. When she stepped outside, A black car was already waiting, its driver holding the door like she was royalty. The Larchmont towered above the skyline, its rooftop garden glowing with strings of light and clusters of glass orbs suspended in the trees. Live music floated from somewhere near the fountain, and trays of champagne passed between guests in tuxedos and diamonds. Celia hesitated at the edge of the event, her fingers tightening around the clutch. Then she saw him. Xavier stood near the far terrace, speaking with a group of men in suits. But the moment he saw her, he stopped mid-sentence. Their eyes locked, everything else disappeared. He crossed the space between them without a word, stopping just close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. "You're stunning," she swallowed. "You're not so bad yourself. You came." "Yes." "Does that mean you're ready?" Celia met his gaze. "It means I'm not walking away." He offered his arm. She slid hers through it. As they moved through the crowd together, conversations paused, heads turned. The whispers didn't bother her anymore, because with every step, Xavier's grip tightened ever so slightly. And in that subtle, quiet way, he told her he wasn't going anywhere either. Later, as the city glittered below them and the music swelled, Xavier guided her to a quieter corner of the terrace. "I brought you here for a reason," he said, lowering his voice. Celia tilted her head. "Besides making everyone wonder who I am," he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin envelope. "I had this drawn up yesterday." She took it with hesitant fingers, opening the flap. It wasn't a proposal. It was a transfer request. Her position moved to the innovation division, independent, no direct reporting to him, no overlap. "Why would you do this?" "I told you I wouldn't let power be a question," he said. "I want us to have a real chance, without shadows. Without secrets." She stared at the document. "This is a big step. I'm not afraid of big steps. I'm only afraid of pretending I don't want more." Celia looked up at him. "So this is you laying it all out?" "This is me," he said, "falling for the woman who stayed late and didn't realize she was already everything I'd been missing." Her breath caught. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, she reached up and kissed him. It wasn't soft or tentative. It was months of tension, weeks of unspoken truths, and a night full of clarity crashing into one perfect moment. The city roared beneath them, but all she felt was him. Celia stood at the edge of the rooftop terrace, watching the lights of the city blink like distant fireflies. The air had cooled, the last notes of music fading into background chatter. Her hand still tingled from where Xavier had held it, steady and sure, while the rest of her world had shifted beneath her feet. She wasn't the same woman who stayed late because she didn't want to be forgotten. She wasn't the invisible name behind a project folder or the afterthought in a campaign meeting. Not anymore. Xavier stepped beside her, his tux jacket now slung over one shoulder, his white shirt slightly wrinkled from the night. He didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at her, the way he always had when no one else was paying attention, as if she were the answer to a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking. "You haven't said much since we came back from the terrace," he said, his voice quieter now. Celia leaned her forearms on the railing, her fingers brushing the cool metal. "I'm still trying to process everything. The transfer, the gala, you. Too much too fast?" "Maybe just enough," she said, glancing at him. "But I've never had anyone rearrange their company structure for me before." "It was overdue," he said simply. She gave a small laugh, but it faded quickly. "You know this changes everything, right? Even outside the office, people talk. Perceptions shift. I know exactly what it changes." She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "And you're okay with being questioned, judged?" "I've been judged since I was 21, he said. "For the way I took over, for the way I run things, for not being my father. I stopped caring the minute I realized none of those people mattered." "You're not worried about the board?" "I've already met with them. They don't get a say in who I care about." He paused, studying her face. "I didn't act on this until I was sure it wouldn't hurt you. I made changes to protect you, not just legally but personally." She faced him fully now. "So you've had this all planned out?" "Only the parts I could control," he said. "The rest, I've been hoping you'd meet me halfway." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of awareness, of unspoken questions that no longer needed answers. "I never thought someone like you would even notice me," she said, her voice softer now. "I used to look at the executive floor like it was another planet. I noticed the first time you corrected your manager in a meeting without flinching," he replied. "You didn't even realize I was there. And you didn't care if you stepped on toes as long as you kept the work honest." Celia looked down, her cheeks warming. "I wasn't trying to impress anyone. That's exactly why you did." The rooftop door creaked open behind them, and a staff member approached with a discreet nod. "Mr. Ashford, your car's waiting. Shall I have it brought around?" Xavier glanced at Celia. "You ready to go?" She hesitated, then nodded. The car was sleek and understated, its interior quiet as they glided through the city. Celia's fingers traced the edge of the window, watching buildings blur past. She felt Xavier's gaze shift to her once, then again. "You're not going back to your place tonight," he said, not as a question, her brows lifted. "No, you're coming with me." She turned toward him, unsure. "That's a bold assumption." "I've made bolder ones," he said. She considered it, then leaned back against the seat. "All right. But I'm not letting you win every argument just because you wear three-piece suits better than anyone I've ever met. I wouldn't respect you if you did." The car slipped into a private drive behind a building she'd only seen in magazines. The penthouse was at the top of 52 floors, and the elevator didn't stop for anyone without a key. When they stepped into the space, it didn't feel like a palace. It felt like a home subtle, lived in, filled with warmth rather than opulence. Soft lighting, dark wood floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to the world outside. Xavier loosened his tie and set his cufflinks on a tray by the bar. "I have a guest room if you want space." Celia took a slow step forward, slipping off her heels. "You think I came all the way up here for the view?" He turned to face her, and something shifted in his expression. "I didn't want to assume." "Then let me make it clear." She closed the space between them. "I don't want a guest room, I want honesty. I want to stop pretending we're just two people who bumped into each other after hours." He lifted a hand to her cheek, his touch grounding. "I stopped pretending the moment I saw you." She leaned into his touch. "Then we're on the same page." They didn't speak after that. The next morning, sunlight poured through the high windows, warming the pale sheets tangled at the foot of the bed. Celia stirred, blinking against the brightness. The scent of coffee drifted in from the kitchen. She sat up slowly, wrapping the sheet around her as she padded barefoot down the hall. Xavier stood by the stove, barefoot in dark joggers and a plain gray tee. He was flipping something in a skillet, his hair still damp from a shower. "Is this your billionaire breakfast routine?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. He looked over his shoulder. "Only when I'm trying to impress someone." She walked over and plucked a piece of toast from the plate. "You don't need to try that hard. I'm not taking chances." They ate at the island, the city stretching below them. No pressure, no rush. When she set down her mug, she turned to him. "So what now?" Xavier leaned back in his stool. "Now we stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. We stop asking permission. You think it's that easy?" "No," he said, "but I think it's worth it." She reached across the counter and took his hand. "Then let's make it worth it." Later that week, Celia moved into her new role. Her office was smaller but private, tucked into a quiet corner of the innovation floor. Her projects were her own. She answered to no one but herself. And every now and then, she'd glance up to see a familiar figure in the doorway. No announcements, no grand entrances, just a look that said everything. They didn't need to explain it to anyone, because the truth had already taken root. She stayed late at the office, not realizing the CEO had been falling for her all along. But now she knew. And she wasn't running from it, not anymore. A month later, Celia stood in the narrow dressing room of a boutique tucked behind a glass courtyard in Tribeca. A sales associate hovered nearby, adjusting the hem of a pale gold gown that shimmered like champagne in the light. She wasn't used to fittings or personal stylists, but this wasn't just another investor gala or executive dinner. This was the Ashford Foundation's annual charity gala, Xavier's signature event. The one his mother used to host before the press dubbed him the Golden Heir. The one that raised millions for children's hospitals, with politicians and celebrities waiting all year for invitations. Xavier had asked her to go with him, not as a statement, not as a surprise, but as his partner. Celia turned to the mirror as the sales associate stepped back. She barely recognized herself. The woman in the reflection was polished, elegant, but the fire in her eyes was unchanged. That was hers. That had never belonged to anyone else. Later that evening, she stepped out of the car into a sea of flashbulbs, her hand tucked into the crook of Xavier's arm. He wore a midnight black suit with a velvet collar, his cufflinks engraved with the Ashford crest. He didn't look like a man performing for cameras. He looked calm, centered, like he'd already found what mattered. Inside, the ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers and candlelit tables adorned with white orchids. Waiters moved like shadows, and a string quartet played somewhere near the grand staircase. As they entered, a tall woman in a silver gown approached them. Her hair was swept into a sleek chignon, and her smile was precise. "Xavier," she said, kissing the air beside his cheek. "I was starting to think you'd skip this year." "I wouldn't dare," he said. "Celia, this is Adrienne Voss. She sits on the board of the foundation." Celia extended her hand. "It's lovely to meet you." Adrienne's eyes flicked over her, assessing but not unkind. "So you're the one who finally managed to get him to stop working past midnight." Celia laughed once. "Still working on that." Adrienne's lips curved into something more genuine. "Well, he's been insufferably focused for years. I'm glad someone got through." After Adrienne left, Celia leaned in. "She's terrifying." "She used to terrify me too," Xavier said, "until I started beating her in negotiations." "You're serious." "She once tried to block a deal I made for pediatric trauma centers. I offered her a counter-proposal that doubled the funding and guaranteed her name on all the plaques." Celia arched a brow. "You bribed her with legacy." "I motivated her with ego." "It's not the same thing." By the time dinner was served, Celia had been introduced to more billionaires, senators, and tech innovators than she could count. But Xavier never drifted far. His hand found hers beneath the table more than once, fingers brushing her knuckles in quiet intervals of reassurance. Halfway through dessert, the master of ceremonies took the stage. The room fell silent as Xavier stood beside the podium, adjusting the lapel of his jacket before speaking. "This event began with my mother," he said. "She believed in building more than structures. She believed in building futures." Celia watched him, heart swelling as he continued, a man who no longer had to prove his worth, but chose to use it. After the speech, as applause filled the room, he returned to their table and leaned close. "I have something to show you." She followed him through a side corridor, up a private stairwell, and out onto a balcony that overlooked the city. Below, the Hudson reflected the last glimmer of sunset, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine from the potted plants lining the railing. "This is where she used to come after the speeches," Xavier said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "She hated crowds. But she loved watching people from up here." Celia stepped beside him. "I can see why," he glanced at her. "I used to come up here when I needed to remember why I was doing any of this." She turned toward him. "And now," his voice dropped. "Now I come up here because it's where I want to ask you something." Her breath caught. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Celia stared at it, unsure if she was imagining it. "I'm not asking you to say yes tonight," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring unlike any she'd ever seen. It was delicate, with a single sapphire flanked by 2 diamonds, set in a band of white gold that shimmered like morning frost. "I'm asking you to know that I'm certain," she blinked, barely breathing. "I didn't fall into this," he continued. "I walked into it, eyes open, and I don't want a version of my future that doesn't have you in it." She stepped closer, voice trembling. "You're not supposed to make me cry in a dress this expensive. Then say something before I do." She reached for his hand and closed the box gently. I'm not saying yes tonight, she whispered, but I'm not letting you ask anyone else. His jaw clenched slightly. That's good enough for me. They stayed on the balcony long after the music below faded. No cameras, no expectations. Just two people who had found something extraordinary in the most unexpected place. 6 months later, Celia stood in the courtyard of the Ashford family estate, surrounded by magnolias in full bloom. The ceremony was small, quiet, intimate in a way that felt deeply personal. No press, no headlines, just friends, family, and the people who had walked the path with them. Xavier waited at the altar in a tailored navy suit, his hair slightly tousled despite the stylist's best efforts. Celia walked toward him in a gown of soft silk, her hand steady in her father's arm, her eyes locked only on him. When she reached him, he took her hand and whispered, "You kept me waiting," she smiled. "You knew I would." The vows were simple, raw, promises made not from tradition but from truth. "I used to think I had everything," Xavier said, voice quiet but unwavering. "Then you walked into my life and I realized I was just holding space for something real." Celia's voice trembled, but she didn't pause. "I didn't come here looking for love, but I found a man who saw me before I saw myself. And I'm not letting that man go." They kissed as the wind stirred the trees and the sun broke through the clouds like a blessing. Later, under a canopy of stars and hanging lanterns, they danced barefoot in the grass, shoes long forgotten. Laughter echoed through the garden and champagne flowed freely. Celia leaned into Xavier's arms, her head resting against his chest. "I still can't believe you saw me that night," she murmured. "I saw you long before that," he said. "I just didn't know how much I needed you until you walked away," she tilted her head. "I didn't walk away." "No," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You walked straight through every wall I built." And with that, they danced into the night, the billionaire who'd stopped chasing numbers, and the woman who taught him what really mattered. Their story had never been about money or power or status. It had always been about seeing each other. And choosing love, every single day.